Vidhutakalpanajala Gambhirodaramurtaye Namasamanta Bhadraya Samanta Spuranatvishe. What I just recited as an auspicious beginning, as a Mangalacarana, is a verse by Acharya Dharmakirti, which is interpreted in different ways, but one of the main understandings is that it praises the Buddha in terms of the three bodies, the three kayas of a Buddha. And this seems suitable as what we're reading is a form of Mahayana philosophy, a form of Mahayana view. And it falls under the Yogācāra system, which is one of the two ways in which the Mahayana view is established. The Mahayana view of emptiness, the idea that everything is illusory. We are reading from a text by the great master Acharya Vasubandhu, whose contribution to the Buddhist tradition was such that he was even called like a second Buddha. And Vasubandhu was the half brother of Asanga, Arya Asanga, who is one of the two main masters in the Mahayana tradition, establishing both the view, the meditation and conduct. So Nagarjuna and Asanga usually are regarded as the two great chariots of the Mahayana, meaning the two who really helped establish the Mahayana view of emptiness. We are reading from a text called the 30 Verses, the Trimshika, and this text offers an outline of the Yogācāra, or rather we can also call it Vijñapti Matrata. So to start, maybe I should explain these words. The word Yogācāra. The word yoga can mean generally practice. It can also refer specifically to samadhi due to one of the meanings of the root yuj. And in that case, Yogācāra can be understood as the practice of meditation. And this school follows a very large treatise by Asanga, which is called the levels or the grounds, the bhumis of meditation practice. So yoga, achara, bhumi. So we can understand the name of the school as being based on this very large treatise. The word Yogācāra appears also in texts which are not specifically from this school. So the idea of practicing meditation, of course, is common to all the Buddhist traditions. But this treatise is the one that really was emphasized by this school. So that's one of the reasons why we have this particular name for the whole school. Then we have the other term that I have quickly mentioned was Vijñapti Matrata. This means the fact that there is only cognition. So Vijñapti here means cognition, and Matra means only. So Vijñapti Matra means only cognition. So all that exists is only cognition. There is nothing that exists which is not cognition. Another way to say it is Chitta Matra, mind only. Everything that exists is mind. There is nothing outside of mind. So this is already an indication of the view that is going to be presented in this text and in the Yogācāra tradition more broadly. And it is through this view that the Yogācāra masters establish both types of selflessness. So, as many of you probably already know, the Buddhist tradition is distinguished by this view that there is no self. And this view has different aspects. One aspect is that there are impermanent, dependently arisen things which belong both to materiality and consciousness, and these things that we normally describe in a deeper level of analysis lack a permanent core, which we could call a permanent person. So we might think that there is something within us which is permanent, which never changes, which goes from lifetime to lifetime, but actually such permanent core doesn't exist from the perspective of the Buddhist tradition. And in fact, the perpetuation of suffering comes from grasping at such a notion that there is a permanent core of our identity. And the other aspect of selflessness, which brings us specifically into Mahayana, is the idea that even these finer elements of existence, which are dependently arisen, are in some sense illusory. So while the non-Mahayana schools do not regard them as being illusory, the Mahayana schools regard that even these very fine elements of existence, these subtle elements of existence, which make up for our mind, body, and environment, which constantly arise and disappear, all these elements also are actually illusory. It's not just that a permanent identity of a person is not there, but also all the elements on which we might have built that notion of an identity, those also are illusory. So that is called the selflessness of, we could call them things. Now I will introduce the two terms that are related to what I've explained in Sanskrit. One of the terms is Pudgala Nairatmya. So Nairatmya comes from Nir Atman, which means without a self. Pudgala is a person. So Pudgala Nairatmya means the selflessness of persons. The other one is Dharma Nairatmya. Dharma refers here to things, so to entities. There are several different meanings for the word dharma. I will get back to that. But in this case, the word dharma refers to an entity. So all entities, whether they belong to materiality or consciousness, all of them are without a self in the sense that they are illusory. So this is the twofold selflessness. And according to Vasubandhu's own student, Stiramati, who wrote a very detailed commentary on this text, it is precisely to elucidate these two aspects of selflessness that his master, the Acharya Vasubandhu, composed this treatise. And the purpose of elucidating these two types of selflessness is that in this way we remove what are called the two obscurations, which is our mental afflictions and also what blocks our knowledge. When we remove the first type of obscuration, we become free of suffering. When we remove the second type of obscuration, on top of being free of suffering, we become a Buddha in the sense of a complete Buddha like Shakyamuni Buddha, who is omniscient. And then we are in a better position to help others. And this is the goal of Mahayana practice. So here you can also understand the relationship between view and practice. The view gives us the basic sense of direction and rationale to engage in a certain practice, and the view also is what ultimately will give rise to non-conceptual awareness, the genuine wisdom that is the basis to eventually become a Buddha. So this gives you an idea of some of the purposes of the treatise. Another purpose which is mentioned by Stiramati is that there are some people who have a strong attachment either to a self or to entities regarded as selfless but still as real, and because of that they don't understand the view of mind only, and this treatise will help with that. A third purpose is that there exist within the Buddhist tradition two ways of establishing the middle path, which according to the Yogācāra are not quite perfect. Namely, according to some, consciousness is real, it's momentary, dependently a reason, etc., but real. And also the object of consciousness, so also materiality, also it's real. Also dependent a reason, it is momentary but real. So this, from the perspective of this text, is one extreme. The other view is that both of those are actually just conventional. They're not ultimately real. Both of them, both the object of consciousness as well as consciousness, both of these are just conventional. That is another extreme. So from the perspective of this text, from the perspective of the Yogācāra system, the middle path is that the object of consciousness is purely conventional, is unreal, but consciousness is ultimately real. It is momentary, it is dependently a reason, but it really arises and ceases moment by moment. So this is the two extreme views which are discarded by learning well about these teachings. In this manner, this text addresses both those who are completely misunderstand or don't understand the two types of selflessness, and those who understand it but not perfectly. So this is the general context. It can, I hope, offer some idea of what this particular treatise is about, and also what the Yogācāra system more broadly is about. So it's about establishing a Mahayana view, which can be the basis to achieve both freedom from samsara, freedom from suffering, as well as complete Buddhahood. And to do so in such a way that it is a middle path perfectly compatible with all the teachings of a Buddha. So it's an interpretation of the teachings of a Buddha, both the non-Mahayana sutras as well as the Mahayana sutras, that regards this middle path that I have delineated as being the proper way to understand all the teachings in a harmonious way. So the middle path is mind only. The middle path is to recognize that there is only mind, that yes, the mind may be momentary, dependent on reason, but that dependent arising really happens. So this is for context. now I would like to read the first verse. So I will recite it, and then we will go through the English, but I want to go through each word somewhat in detail because I feel that this could help those who don't yet have much familiarity with this system to have a kind of introduction to the system. So the verse is Atma Dharmo Pacharo hi Vividho yav pravartate Vijnana Pariname sau Parinama Sachatridha. So this is our verse. And let me show you what happens when we split the words. So for those of you who are not familiar with Sanskrit, when you see strings of words written all together, you might think that Sanskrit is so difficult, but it's also a matter of a convention in the writing. So if I show you the same words in this manner, you can see that they're made of smaller units. And so if we split it, it is Atma Dharma Upacharaha Hi Vividaha Yaha Pravartate Vijnana Pariname Asau Parinamaha Saha Cha Tridha. Okay. So I hope that this gives you some idea of the sounds. And one of the reasons I'm doing this is because I would encourage anyone who wishes to learn about Yogācāra to recite this verse maybe once a day or so, to become familiar with this verse. Even if you haven't studied Sanskrit, it doesn't really matter if you do not recite it really perfectly, but you can try and slowly reflect on each of the words, and this will offer you a basis, a kind of red thread for your contemplation. And this is something that I really, really recommend. And one of the ways in which I would like to convince you that it is worth doing so is to really go through each word. So the first word in our verse is Atma Dharmopacharaha, which due to Sandhi, due to changes in the sounds when they encounter other sounds, becomes Atma Dharmopacharo. And this is made of these three elements, Atma, Dharma, and Upachara. So let me start by discussing for a while the word Atman. Because this is a much more difficult word, in fact, to relate to, I feel, maybe for those who are not familiar with Sanskrit and who are not familiar with the overall context of Sanskrit thought. So the difficulty comes from the fact that Atman is, in a way, something very simple and mundane in certain usages. It's just something like a reflexive pronoun. When I want to say that I do something by myself, I can use the term Atman. And it just means I am the one who is doing it. I'm doing it myself. I'm not asking someone else to do it. So this is a rather simple, mundane type of identification that doesn't necessarily have very deep implications in terms of what we believe to be ultimately real. On the other hand, the term Atman is the focus for many non-Buddhist systems of thought in Sanskrit, expressed in the Sanskrit tradition. In many of these systems, in fact, the idea is that there is a real core to our identity, an enduring, immutable core that we are unable to usually recognize. We grasp at things which are impermanent as if they were that core. In other words, we confuse what is impermanent as being something permanent instead of focusing on what is really permanent, that core, that inner core of our identity. And if we're able to recognize that core, which might be understood either as being a different one for each of us or as being a universal reality that is just without any differentiation, either way. But if we recognize that, then we will be beyond suffering. So that is the recurring idea in the non-Buddhist systems, which then is makes the term Atman in that case a very charged term, a term which has a lot of philosophical weight, so to speak. And that type of view is the view which in the Buddhist tradition is regarded as the extreme view of eternalism, and one of the two extremes to be avoided. There's another point that the word Atman can also mean nature. So sometimes the word Atman is used in the Buddhist tradition to just refer to the nature of something. And this usage also causes confusion in a certain context when people are not sufficiently familiar with the overall nature of Buddhist thought, and they jump to the conclusion that it's the same as those non-Buddhist systems, but in fact it is completely different, because selflessness is through and through. It's really the backbone, we could say, of the Buddhist view, and is really, really crucial in at all levels, in all types of explanation. So the word Atman, as you may have understood, also is just a simple identifier. This should already give us the idea that there are contexts where the Buddha himself will use it, not necessarily just to say it doesn't exist, but even just to say you should do this by yourself, then the word Atman might come up, but without any strong implication about positing something permanent, etc. The second term that we have here is dharma, and this term, I believe many are by now familiar with it. It's now part of the English language as well. This term in the Buddhist tradition is used in a very wide variety of meanings, but we can identify, let's say, four very important meanings according, let's say, to Nagarjuna. Nagarjuna mentions these meanings. One of the meanings, well, Chandrakirti, sorry. One of the meanings of dharma is the teachings of a Buddha. In that case, sometimes this is called Saddharma. Saddharma means the dharma of the good ones, which means the noble ones, the Aryas who have realized the nature of realities, which means the Buddhas, the Bodhisattvas on the higher levels, and also the Arhats, those who are liberated, etc. The other meaning is Saddharma as the holy or good dharma. That's the other possible explanation. So pavitra, sat as pavitra, both explanations are okay. And in this case, we are referring to the teachings of a Buddha, the second of the three jewels in which the Buddhists take refuge. Another meaning is that dharma just means good behavior, virtue, so practicing virtue as opposed to practicing non-virtuous behavior. That is dharma. That's another meaning. Another meaning is just friendliness, the wish for others to be happy. That is also one of the meanings of the word dharma. And this is, of course, interesting. It emphasizes how important this maitri or maitra, this feeling of friendliness or friendship, this feeling, this wish for others to be happy is in the Buddhist teachings. The meaning that here is relevant is dharma as an entity. Now, all these meanings in one way or the other are connected to the same verbal root dra, which means to hold, to maintain, to support, to hold back, or to have. In the case of the meaning of dharma as entity, which is the one that is relevant here, it means that something has a specific feature, a specific characteristic that distinguishes it from other entities. Swalakshana dharana dharma. So, dharmas in the Buddhist tradition are usually regarded as ultimately existent. Well, there's two types. There are those which are purely imputed, but the ones which are mostly described, analyzed, are dharmas which make up for the finest elements of existence, the subtlest aspect of causality, the subtlest aspect of perception. So these dharmas tend to be at the limits of time, at the limits of space. They are extremely minute in case they are material entities located in space. They are momentary, so they last for infinitesimal amounts of time. And they are dependently arisen. They always arise from at least a minimum of two causes, and very often more. An assemblage of causes and conditions causes them to arise. There are also some dharmas which are not dependently arisen, but not everyone accepts them. So these dharmas are described precisely to show that although we grasp at our mind and body in terms of a permanent identity, such permanent identity was never there. So by learning about these dependently arisen dharmas that arise and cease, we weaken this grasping, and when we are able to directly see them in meditative states, this grasping is completely eradicated, and the whole basis for samsara is gone, because there is no more basis for us to have attraction, aversion, or any form of delusion. So this is, in brief, the meaning of these two words. Then we have the word upajara. This is a key term in this particular verse, because in fact it's a helpful way for Vasubandhu to indicate the shift into a Mahayana perspective. So upajara, as you can see in my translation here, I translated as approximation, and this refers to an approximation of speech, something like a metaphor, which might or might not be intentional. It's a type of superimposition. So an upajara is when we speak, we use a certain word, but actually we mean something slightly different. We don't mean it literally. So in other words, it's a non-literal expression that refers to something else. Now, these 2 points are important. The expression is not literal. It doesn't literally refer to what we are saying, but it does refer to something. So this understanding of the nature of this superimposition or approximation of speech is also related to the way in which Yogācāra establishes the middle path. This term is, okay, let me give you first an example of an upajara to make it clearer maybe what I'm referring to. Is like when we say the student is fire, Agnir Manavaka. So when we say that the student is fire, this is an expression that could refer to different qualities of a student. It doesn't mean literally that we are teaching to a flame. Our student might be a human being, a person. We don't mean to say that the student is not human. But what we want to highlight is that maybe the student really, really has a very red complexion, for example, or the student is very sharp. The student is able to consume everything like firewood. So that is the reason we even do this upacāra. The idea is we do this approximation of speech, in this case, in this example that I've offered, in order to have a greater impact with our speech, in order to say something a bit more striking that will highlight to our listeners even more strongly how much the student has certain qualities. So then we say the student is fire, without meaning to say that we are teaching to a non-human flame. That is not really what we mean. So this is one type of approximation, superimposition, or metaphor. We could use these different terms. So what this first expression tells us is that both self and dharmas, so both the Atma and Dharma, both this word which refers to a continuous identity and the other word which refers to entities more broadly, both these actually, the various words that we use to refer to these two, in fact, are approximations of speech. They don't have literal reference. So that's the first thing that he says. Then he says that this approximation is manifold. Manifold because this is explained by the commentator. We can say that there is a self, we can say that there is a sattva, so ascension being, then jantu, that means like a living being, jiva, again, something like a living being, etc. There are many words that we can use that could be synonyms of Atma. And for dharma, there are many words like form, feeling, sensation, the aggregates, the bases. All of these are different categories of entities that are presented. Now, these expressions occur both in mundane usage as well as in the treatises, in the Buddhist treatises. So, vividaha yaha pravartate means it occurs in many ways, both in mundane usage as well as in various treatises. So this is the first half of a verse. Now we have, okay, I want to add one thing. The first expression, actually, I was mentioning, it is a very skillful way for Vasubandhu to show that we have entered Mahayana territory. Because the idea that the self is an approximation of speech or a metaphor, that is common. That is common to the whole of Buddhism. And it is also discussed in one of Vasubandhu's texts, the Abhidharmakosha Bhashya, which is written not from a Mahayana perspective, but from the perspective of the non-Mahayana schools. So it's an approximation of speech, and very often it is an approximation of speech referring to the mind. So this is another interesting feature, that already when we speak of the self, we often are speaking of the mind in a Buddhist context. And there are several reasons for that. The reasons given by Vasubandhu are that when it comes to the non-Buddhist, the non-Buddhists ascribe to a permanent self certain functions of continuity which actually don't belong to it. They really belong to the continuum of the mind. So it is the continuum of moments of mind arising and ceasing and being causally connected one to the other that ensures this continuity of experience even from one lifetime to the next. It's not an enduring, immutable core. So in that sense, because the non-Buddhists have that idea about the self, sometimes the Buddhists use the word self to refer to the mind as a kind of approximation to highlight that it is actually the mind that has those functions. The other reason is because the mind is our primary identification. So it is said in some texts that there are two types of grasping. There are two types of conceptualizing our experience in terms of a self. One is to take something as a self, and the other one is to take it as something connected to a self. So we might not think that that thing is a self, but we think there is a permanent self, and somehow there is a connection between the two. So what is said in that case is that the primary object of our grasping in terms of what we conceptualize to be a self is in fact consciousness, is in fact awareness, it's in fact the mind. So that's another reason why often we, in the Buddhist text, we find the word Atman used as an approximation for the mind. For example, it is shown by Vasubandhu, but there are cases where when the Buddha says that you should tame yourself by yourself, when we look at the wording of nearby passages, it becomes clear that it means you should tame your own mind. It's the mind that should tame the mind. So the idea that self, the word self, can be used in an approximate sense. This is a common idea. In those systems, however, the idea that the dharmas are an approximation would not be accepted. The five aggregates, the subtle element of existence that arise and pass away and make up for our body and mind, those are real. They really arise and pass away. But in a Mahayana context, that is not accepted. Those also, in some sense, are illusory. And this text will tell us in which sense they are illusory in a Yogācāra context. Let me add one more point, which also I hope helps understanding how Buddhist philosophy in general works. There is the important idea in the Buddhist tradition that a Buddha never contradicts himself. A Buddha is omniscient. If there is a self-contradiction, that proves that person is not omniscient. So that person is not a Buddha. So the teachings of a Buddha have to be interpreted in such a way as to show that they are always harmonious. In order to do so, it's important to recognize that they have levels. And the main two levels can be called in different ways. One way is to call it Neyartha and Nitartha. Those are very common terms, and that means those where the meaning has already been drawn out, so they can be taken literally, and those where the meaning requires interpretation. Another classification is abhiprayika and lakshanika. That means certain teachings rely on a specific intent. They're not literal. They have an intent. They speak non-literally in order to highlight something. They should not be taken literally. Lakshanika comes from lakshana, which means a defining feature, defining trait, a characteristic. That means certain teachings do actually give us the characteristics of reality. There's another term used for the teachings which are non-literal, and that is aupacārika. So the teaching done through upacāra, metaphor or approximation. So according to the non-Mahayana schools, when the Buddha speaks in terms of persons enduring through time, that is always an approximation of speech. So we find it even in the introductory sections of the sutras when we say that there was this and that person, etc. That's always an approximation. But when the Buddha speaks in terms of subtle, dependently arisen entities, dharmas, those descriptions of dharmas should not be taken as approximations. So this is why I was saying that this choice of words is a very clear indication of how we are shifting into a Mahayana system. And this is also by an implicit reference to his own presentation of the approximation of speech, which is the word self. Now, the question is, if this is an approximation of speech, what does it really refer to? And this is answered in the next quarter of the verse. Vijnana pariname asau. So asau, so that approximation, that superimposition, actually refers to only and always the transformation of consciousness. So that's how I have translated it. How this, I'll have to explain a little bit more. There's always a slight difficulty in finding words in English which do not carry additional connotations and denotations not intended by the Sanskrit, but still I felt that this was the best option. So let me start, in fact, by the second word, parinama. Parinama I've translated as transformation, and parinama means, yes, change. So something which is continuously changing, something like that. The change, transformation does give the sense of something having a form and then taking up another form. That is not really what is meant. And this is actually explained very clearly by the commentator, because this particular term in Sanskrit, parinama, is also used by non-Buddhist philosophers like the Sankhya, where they feel that everything is the transformation of a primordial entity, which is translated as nature, the Prakriti. This primordial entity then has many manifestations, all of which are its transformations. But this is not what is meant. Transformation here doesn't refer to an enduring entity going through different changes. That's not the point. Transformation here is a synonym of pratitya samutpada, arising due to causes and conditions. So what it refers to is that vijnana, consciousness, one moment of vijnana arises due to causes and conditions, and then it's followed by another one which is causally connected, and then another one, and then another one, each moment arising and ceasing. That is what is meant by transformation here, actually. And then we have the word vijnana. Now, this word vijnana comes from the root ña. The word ña is related to the root from which we have the word to know. To cognize, I think, also is connected. And but it means more broadly to be aware, etc., etc. So we usually translate it as consciousness, but it refers to any form of, let's say, broadly speaking, awareness. So whatever is sentience. Now, in the Buddhist tradition, normally we have this system wherein both material elements and consciousness are real. Again, I must repeat, they are dependent reason, they are momentary, they arise and pass away, but this really happens. So in that case, the consciousness is always the perceiver. The consciousness might perceive moments of what we may call materiality or form, so particles which make up for extended objects. So consciousness might actually be the perceiver of that. Sometimes it might even be the perceiver of other consciousnesses. But its main characteristic is indeed to be the perception of something. The very definition of consciousness is that it is the perception of an object, the perception of a point of reference. Now, that aspect of consciousness for the Yogācāra is also false. So all that exists ultimately is consciousness, its mind, since its object. So we start by showing that the object of the mind, we inquire. Yes, we have this perception that, let's say, I'm seeing now, maybe many of us are seeing a computer screen, but does this perception actually really validate anything apart from the perception itself? So this is kind of the question in the Yogācāra system. So we have a perception, we have a strong feeling that there is something that is being perceived. But doesn't the perception only manifest itself rather than manifesting something beyond itself? So how do we go to that conviction that there is something beyond that perception? How do we go to that conviction that there is a computer screen apart from mind? So that is the basic question. And the Yogācāra system goes through several different reasonings to show that, in fact, it is much more reasonable to not posit that additional entity, to just be convinced that everything is mind. Now, that has another implication. If the object of perception is no more than the perception, then consciousness is not really a perceiver because it has never perceived anything. So when we speak of the ultimately existing mind in case of a Yogācāra system, we are speaking of mind in the sense of a continuity free from perceiver and perceived. So that is what is meant by the Vijñāna Parināma. The last quarter of the verse introduces the subdivisions of levels of consciousness according to the Yogācāra system. So it says, Parināma Sajat Tridha. The transformation, and that transformation is threefold. And this is because while other systems usually accept only 6 types of consciousness, namely eye consciousness, ear consciousness, nose consciousness, tongue consciousness, body consciousness, and the thought consciousness, the Yogācāra has 2 other layers, and these become very important in explaining how the whole unfolding of samsara works, and how one can go from the state of an ordinary person to the continuity, the continuum of consciousness becoming the continuum of liberation, or the continuum of liberation and omniscience in case of a Buddha. In other words, the three kayas, the three bodies of the Buddha, which I had mentioned in the beginning, are praised in the Mangalajarana with which I started this brief explanation. So now I will once more recite this verse. Atma dharmopacharo hi vivido yah pravartate vijnana pariname sau parinama sachatridha. So this is what I wanted to introduce to you today, hoping that it might be comprehensible and hoping that I haven't made too many mistakes. If so, I apologize for that. And I also wanted this to be an occasion for some discussion. So I hope that maybe you have questions. Can you explain more about citta is dependent arising if everything is citta? Yeah. Well, citta is dependent arising because all the causal elements belong to citta. So that is really not a problem. Citta is dependent arising, so one moment of mind depends from other causes and conditions which precede it, and all those causes and conditions are also mind. So that is really not, that is not a big problem, because in fact, another text, the 20 verses, shows that you can explain the entire praditya samutpada of samsara, the six realms, etc., if you don't posit two different orders of reality. Now, needing two causes and conditions doesn't mean needing two causes and conditions that belong to two different orders of reality. Those two different causes and conditions can both be actually of the nature of awareness. So there is no problem from the perspective of Yogācāra in reinterpreting the causes and conditions for the arising of a certain citta as being entirely within the realm of citta. Yes, it does. Dependent arising of rupa is just, well, actually, yes and no, because from the Yogācāra, you can speak of parikalpita rupa, you can speak of paratantra rupa and parishpanna rupa. So the rupa has different aspects in itself. So there is of course, if you take rupa in the sense of something which is outside of a mind, that is purely parikalpita. But if you use rupa to describe the mind as arising in a certain way with a different aspect, then that belongs to paratantra. So it depends a little bit from what kind of rupa you're referring to. So it depends also a bit from the context, which level of explanation is being used. Seeking some clarity, Yogācāra posits no externality, but are the object of the senses, form, etc., posited with any form of materiality, physicality, even if it is not external, or that is not possible because dharma is in the nature of the mind? Well, you see, it's a bit ambiguous, because if you take, let's say, rupa means materiality, it behaves in a certain way from the perspective in which we experience it. So if it is just a description, it is a description of aspects of the mind. So in that sense, it's never going to be materiality in the sense of something non-sentient. That is not going to happen. What is the difference between dharmata and swabhava? Well, you could understand it in this way. For example, you could say that swabhava is a broader term. In some context, dharmata can have the same meaning. That is fine. But in some cases, vita itself does the trick. So, for example, dharmata, you could say, is the dharma swabhava, the nature of the dharmas. So that is a little bit contextual. In some cases, it's more or less a synonym. But if you look at the Yogācāra system, usually when we use the word dharmata, we are referring specifically to the nature of the dharmas. So the nature of the dharmas, meaning their general nature of being empty, which means the fact that they never exist as anything but mind. So in that sense, dharmata, in terms of usage, tends to be a little bit more specified. However, in general terms, there are cases where they could be almost synonyms. Does parikalpita only refer to the dharma which exists, or also refer to the dharma not exist like independent self? Both. Yeah, it can be both, I believe. I think it can be both when it comes to parikalpita, yeah. I think one can conceptualize the grahaka and grahaka in many different ways, even completely wrong ones. Can you please explain again the vijnana parinama? Okay. So I took some time with the term parinama because this term might suggest that we have something permanent, enduring, that undergoes different states, so to speak. Just like it is posited in the Samkhya system. So there is this primordial nature which then manifests as different things by undergoing different states. Now, this is not what is meant here. Rather, what is meant here by parinama or transformation is the continuum of dependent arising. So there is one moment of consciousness, that moment disappears, then another moment arises. These moments are causally connected as a continuum, and that continuum of causally connected moment is what we call the transformation of consciousness. Does the emptiness in Yogācāra specifically refer to absence of perceiver and perceived? Yes, it refers to the absence of perceiver and perceived and the existence of that absence. That is how it is explained. Things, namely cognitive events, arise dependently upon causes and conditions. Thus, what is real in this regard refers to function or a process and not the thing, object, and subject itself. You could, in a way, say it in that way. However, the problem, if you put it in that way, is that it suggests that there is a process of related elements, the process is real, but the elements in the process are not real. And I think this distinction between thing and process doesn't really work very well here. So there is a process, if you want to use that word, and in this case, the word process would be a synonym of transformation or parinama. And this process is just a description of single moments of consciousness succeeding each other. So in that sense, so the point is, when we use the word thing, like we use the word dharma, first of all, we have to remember that the word dharma doesn't refer necessarily to external objects. The word dharma, as it is used in the Buddhist tradition, can refer to minimal entities, either of materiality or of consciousness. Those all can be called dharmas in the Buddhist tradition. So in that sense, when we use the word entity in a Buddhist context, it can refer to a moment of mind. So the entities which are moments of mind, those are real. When it says all the dharmas have three svabhava, it means all dharmas can be classified into the three, or each dharma's the threefold svabhava. I think the second, actually, because there is, when for each aggregate, there is, the rupa can be, there is rupa which is the rupa which, in the sense of the parikalpita, there is rupa which is rupa in the sense of the paratantra, there is rupa in the sense of the parinishpanna. So there is rupa as that which is conceptualized as something beyond the mind, that is parikalpita. There is rupa as just the appearance of mind in a certain way. And then there is the emptiness of rupa in the sense of the first not really being there ever in the second. So these three aspects then are applied to all of them. That's my understanding. At least in one presentation that we find in the Abhidharma Samuccaya Bhashya. In the emptiness, is there also something remains at the same time? So in the noble samadhi, do they also observe what remains at the same time? Well, the Vishuddhyalambana, the support of purification, the object of samadhi for the noble ones, it's supposed to be just emptiness. So that's at least is what they focus on during samadhi. Now, so it seems that they were not focusing on the paratantra during samadhi. That's my understanding. That's in fact one of the, so the word paramartha, when we understand the word paramartha as the object of the awareness of a noble one during meditation absorption, samadhi, then paramartha would be the parinishpanna svabhava, the perfected nature, which is emptiness. Could you explain how non-arising and non-cessation is explained according to Yogācāra perspective? Well, it can pertain to different natures. So the non-arising and non-cessation applies to the completely imagined nature, because that object of perception and perceiver never came into existence, and therefore they will never cease. On the other hand, when it comes to emptiness, it applies to it because it was always in that way. emptiness is not something which is Samskrita, is not something which comes from causes and conditions. So both of them, in that sense, are both of these svabhavas can be seen in those terms. So nothing ever arose and nothing will ever cease, therefore, as an object of perception or as a perceiver. That never happens. What arises and ceases is mind free of object of perception and perceiver, although with that illusion. Please, could you explain how do Yogācāra distinguish between what is perceived as external object and what is purely in... Okay. Between what is perceived as external object and what is purely imagined. So, actually, it's distinctions in degrees, in a way. Let me see if this helps with this. A question similar to this appears in the 20 verses, because the question has relevance for karma. So, for example, how can you say that we have the karma, the very negative karma of killing, pranatipata, if there are no external beings? But here the answer is yes, all what we perceive is illusory. There is no external environment really, but there is a coordination between different mind streams. So when one person kills another person, there is an influence from the mind stream of one person to the mind stream of another person. That influence is misperceived as an interaction between bodies, external bodies. But in fact, what is happening is that one of the minds ends up causing a discontinuity in the mental continuum of the other one. So in the perception of the other one, which then experiences the illusion of death. Is the citta of the noble ones who are in samadhi is also an imagination? No, it's not. What are the key grounds based on which Yogācāra is critiquing Madhyamaka as being an extreme, including differences in their view on externality? Including differences in view on externality. And this I don't quite understand, because this would not really apply really to all Madhyamaka. But anyway, the ground was, I implicitly introduced it a little bit earlier. The idea is that when you have an approximation of speech, you are, in the end, there is some referent. So language cannot be purely non-referential. That is there has to be a difference between something which really arises and ceases and something which is purely imagined. The arising, the fact that something has causes and conditions proves that it really arises. It doesn't prove that it doesn't arise. That will be their main criticism. So the Madhyamaka have a somewhat counterintuitive position, according to which the fact that something has arisen from causes and conditions, in fact, proves that it hasn't really arisen. So this actually is a rather counterintuitive position and needs to be explained at length by the Madhyamaka by, in the end, pointing to the fact that there is an implication, let's say, that when two things depend on each other as concepts, if they depend on each other even existentially. And this is where other systems might have a problem, because they would feel that when you say that one thing causes the other, it's quite different from saying that the concept of one thing causes the concept of another. These two things should be distinguished. So, for example, in Madhyamaka, it is said that these two things are unreal. They're like long and short. You don't have a notion of long without seeing something else with it's short. And this, however, others would say, well, that might prove something about the concept of long and short, but this doesn't mean that if you have two sticks and you have only one of them, that stick disappears. So the notional dependence for them cannot ultimately result in that. Imagination is paratantra or paratantra svabhava. Paratantra and paratantra svabhava are synonyms. So in Noble Samadhi, they do have paratantra. Well, in some sense, probably, but then paratantra is not abhuta parikalpa, because it's not construing that illusion. If by paratantra we just mean the vijnana parinama, then yes, that would be there, but because the certain types of vijnana that never cease, in fact. Never cease in terms of continuum. Of course, all of them cease moment by moment, but in terms of continuum, some of them, the continuum never has gaps, let's put it this way. Would you please explain karma and ale vijnana? Okay. Well, that is kind of long. For karma and ale vijnana, well, each karma deposits a seed in the ale vijnana, and then the seed later on, when the conditions are there, matures into a certain experience. And certain karmas also result in the manifestation of a realm of existence. So that's why the Ale Vijnana is called Vipaka, the maturation consciousness. Can you explain more about Abhuta Parikalpa exists in emptiness? Well, this is a way to express the relationship between things and the nature of things. So you can understand it in this way. The things and their nature are coextensive. You cannot really posit them as identical. You cannot really posit them as completely different. Neither of those really works, but they are coextensive. When one is there, the other one is there. You are never going to have, you cannot speak of emptiness without speaking of something which is empty. So in that sense, we're speaking of emptiness. What is it that is empty? The Abhuta Parikalpa. So in that sense, it exists in emptiness. Yeah, it is just empty of Abhuta. Exactly. Exactly. Precisely. The Paratantra is empty of Parikalpita. Abhuta is same as parikalpita. Viparikalpa is empty of parikalpita. The imagination is empty of what it imagines. Good? It's nice to have all these questions. Okay, is Yogācāra now completely clear? Or do you have other questions? You can ask a question, you can ask me to re-explain something, that is also fine, whatever. Okay, well, I don't see questions at the moment, so I think maybe we can finish here. So thank you very much for joining, and I will see you next time. Thanks a lot.
Yeah.
Yeah. Goodbye. Thank you.